Good afternoon. We're delighted to be here in a great transition from what Shoshana was telling us about a new landscape, because we believe we're at the dawn of a new era of web, with blockchain, with the decentralized web. And I'm going to jump in right away into the conversation on, is this the constitutional moment for us to imagine a better governance? Is this the moment that we have to grasp to create a better future? Very linked to the light at the end of Shoshana's speech. We're in a unique opportunity at McCourt Institute. We're tackling this topic of, can we build rapidly and smartly the governance and the foundation for the next generation of web, which is, we're at the dawn. And I'm going to start with you, Daniel, right? We're going to just jump in. What is a constitutional moment? Tell us a little bit about, historically, what does it mean, actually?
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Scheherazade. It's great to be here with everybody. A constitutional moment is disorienting. And I have to admit, I think we all feel a little disoriented in this Web3 moment. In my case, it might also be just that I haven't been to New York since before the pandemic. So I'm really disoriented at the moment, the shed and the vessel and things like that. But when you feel that feeling, you know something big is happening. Specifically, it's important to start by acknowledging that a constitution isn't just a piece of paper. A constitution is first and foremost a piece of engineering, a piece of design. And the Constitution that was drafted at the end of the 18th century was a design for organizing power and its operations. That design sat on the social platform of the late 18th century, the economic, demographic, technological platform of the late 18th century. The design made sense in relationship to that platform. So if that platform changes, you get a constitutional moment. You get a need for redesign. You also get de facto redesigns just because of the underlying shifts in that platform. So just one more thought here, and then I'll hand it back, Scheherazade. It's not as if this is the first time we've had a constitutional moment being driven by impacts on the undergirding social platform. There was the Industrial Revolution, for example. That really is part of the reason enslavement got driven out of the system. And of course, we had to have the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments to make that real from a legal point of view. There's the travel revolution. We wouldn't have the UN and systems of global governance if air travel weren't possible. So that important early 20th century revolution. There's the biotech revolution. Governments have become systems of social insurance with, defense as a side business. That's only possible because of our capacities with regard to the provision of health and other elements of human well-being. And now we have, of course, broadcast media and then the internet. And there's a lot more to be said about how that has impacted, again, that underlying social platform. That's what we're going to talk about today. But that's what makes this a constitutional moment.
Thank you. Moving on to you, Glenn, on a little bit the why. So you're a builder, an experimenter. You put the word radical both in your book, Radical Markets, and in your organization, Radical Exchange. So what's so radical about this moment, and what do you think needs to be decentralized?
Well, really to pick up where Danielle left off, I think the fundamental problem we're facing is that a bunch of assumptions and constraints that we've taken for granted that were always sort of very much driven by the structure of technology and how we interacted are sort of falling away or getting rearranged. The nation state and the federal system of the United States were built on very geographic notions of who would interact with each other and who wouldn't. The internet is breaking those down. And so it's breaking down the whole way that our system of representation is intended to ameliorate the divisions between us and address conflicts. And so we're being forced to imagine new ones. The assumptions that underlie, for example, our systems of property, or as Danielle's worked on, our educational systems, were really based on what, given the technology platforms of the past, we were able to account for, write down in administrative systems, make sense of, those were in a lot of tension with the way that people lived, indigenous people lived, and the way that people in Europe before modern administrative states lived. But they were forced on us by our ability to keep records and so forth. That's been broken. We have the capacity to do all kinds of other things. That could lead to all sorts of horrors, like Shoshana was highlighting. It also leads to all kinds of possibilities. And we don't have the option of going back. We only have the option of choosing how we want to navigate that and build a future that takes advantages of these opportunities and avoids the potential pitfalls.
Rob, you've guessed I'm coming to you with the how question. Because I think the big question is, what are the shared norms and community standards among people working in the decentralized web, and how realistic is it
Sure.
for this to work out?
Well, I want to take the idea of a constitutional moment and use it metaphorically, as I think Danielle and Glen also had in mind, although a little part of me heard Danielle and thought, oh, maybe we would wish on the different 21st century set of platforms to have another constitutional convention and actually design a new constitution for the 21st century. I heard Glen say our current technological platforms and others are slowly eating away at the nation state itself, and we need something different. Both of those things might be possible and or desirable, but I want to use the metaphor of a constitutional moment to think about the technical architecture of a decentralized web and the ways in which these very standards and technical protocols are being developed now that open up a whole host of new possibilities that will steer us away from the kind of dystopia that you just heard from Shoshana Zuboff and towards something that's quite different. And what I have in mind there with respect to community norms is a constitutional moment not with respect to our formal political systems, the way that the actual US Constitution is intended to design how representation works and how governance works at a federal, state, communal level, but rather the shared norms of technologists and others who work with them to bring about the kinds of standards and expectations, shared views about what counts as the responsible development of a technology. And since we're at this dawning age of a set of new technical architectures, decentralized technical architectures, it seems to me very important that we not have this come about in a way that is driven solely by a set of commercial interests, get to scale as quickly as possible, monetize as quickly as possible, and instead develop some shared norms across the commercial and non-commercial space, of course, ultimately in tandem with formal systems of regulation policy at the level of the law. And I'll just give one illustration of what I have in mind here. I'm a political theorist. I work now with a whole bunch of computer scientists at Stanford, and I come from Silicon Valley, so it's in certain respects the air I breathe there. And the thing that I've observed is that there's a common phrase used by technologists quite frequently that sings a song of praise to openness. And you often hear this idea about democratizing AI or democratizing technology, which is often intended to mean something as simple as, let's put these extraordinary technical possibilities in the hands of as many people as possible. And democratizing means nothing more than sharing in open without restriction to anyone who wants to use it. And when these technical platforms, products, have these multi-purposes, that's an invitation to danger as well as promise. And what I, as the political theorist, always want to say in terms of a shared norm, democracy and democratization is about shared systems of governance. Openness and freedom for all to use something is just one piece of what democratizing is meant to imply. And so the praise for democratizing technology, if it's meant seriously, has to take on board aspirations for shared governance, even if that's outside the formal systems of government in political institutions, for the moment to get standards that cut across industry, that cut across civil society. And that constitutional moment, I think, metaphorically, is where we're at right now with the builders of the decentralized web today.
Can I react to something that you just said, Rob, because I think you hit on a really great point. Perhaps the cardinal sin of the Web3 space has been its focus on, quote, permissionlessness. Permissionlessness is supposed to be an extreme embodiment of this notion of openness.
Right.
But permissionlessness is a mirage, because we know that systems with no permissioning get attacked by a million denial of service. So that, they can't mean that. What they actually mean is permissioning by money, by access to computers to do proof of work or access to coins to do proof of stake, which is not permissionless, it's actually oligarchic. And so now people are rebuilding, well, what do we actually want to build as our systems of permissioning? We don't want them to be top-down, concentrated, in the hands of a few traditional elites. But on the other hand, we don't want them to all be driven by the elite of money either. We want some sort of distributed and participative system of permissioning. But we certainly don't want no permissioning, yes, and we don't want oligarchic permissioning either. So these are the questions we're being forced to wrestle with, and that a lot of our past hasn't really equipped us for, because we've had these assumptions about, well, there's a nation state, maybe there's a little bit of immigration on the line, but we basically know who we're talking about. You don't know in this internet context, and so how do you build that up?
So I wanted to jump in and pick up Rob's question about, was Danielle saying we should have a constitutional convention? And I'm not saying that, okay? I just wanted to make that clear, okay? It's an important thing to be real clear about where you stand on that. Nonetheless, the work that Glen is describing is constituting work. And it's really important to understand that. And so here I want to just pull out a thread Glen put on the table about geography and representation. At the end of the day, the system of political representation that was invented in the 18th century was a solution to the challenge of geographic dispersal. The whole point was you built a structure of representatives who could filter opinion, bring it together, synthesize it, in order to steer a collective body through the decision-making structures of political institutions. So representation was a solution to building a society at scale, despite geographic dispersal. And at the same time, geographic dispersal was actually a premise of how you would have success in the design. Because, as we all know, one of the challenge for democratic governance is faction, tribalism, polarization, or the denial of service attacks and so forth. Like, that's a different way of thinking about the problem of collective governance. And in the 18th century, the expectation was geographic dispersal would mean that anybody with really extreme views couldn't actually find each other and coordinate. They would have to go through representatives who would be those gatekeepers, those filters, those mediators, and the like. That was literally a premise expressed by James Madison of the design of the US Constitution. So social media has completely exploded an actual premise of the Constitution. Does that mean we need a constitutional convention? No. What it does mean is that we have to rethink governance in contexts where there is no geographic dispersal. So that is partly about possibly regulating social media platforms, but that isn't really where, in some sense, the bulk of the work and thinking should be. There's also the question of what other design fixes can address the challenge of faction. For example, I'm a real advocate for ranked choice voting, because there's a way in which it changes the incentive structure around communication and decision-making in ways that mitigate against the challenge of extremism. And by the same token, then we get to the really exciting stuff Glen is talking about. There's also the zone where what we need to do is build new stuff that's thinking about the governance problems from the get-go and does a lot better job than what the stuff built between 1995 and 2015 has done. And that's really, truly where I think the kind of constituting work is, and that's why this conference is so exciting.
Thank you so much. I think, Danielle, you just gave us one solution of what you think. If I had to ask you, other than Rob and Glen, what would be if you had to classify one or two key actions that governments, scholars, technologists, policymakers should be taking now or in the coming 18, 24 months, what would be those actions? What would be your highest recommendation?
Right, to me first, okay.
Yeah, sure.
How do we make it happen?
All right, well, it's sometimes easier to put your finger on things that are important to avoid. So I want to start there, but I'll give you a direct answer as well. So here's my fear about our nascent Web3 decentralized web moment, that the commercial forces that traditionally and historically come into play, which are important, will so overwhelm this building moment of getting some shared norms to respond to the 21st century challenges of the day, that what we'll get out of Web3 is a bunch of private property rights in a decentralized digital architecture that allow for trading of Disney-branded avatars for our thing in the metaverse, and NFTs, which are a way to monetize and enter a space in order to secure a quasi-monopolistic position. And instead of reaching the civic promises, the political, democratic promises of the value of decentralization from a political or civic standpoint, what we'll get is a bunch of unimpressive commercialization of low-hanging fruit to monetize the guarantee of private property in a digital form. That's what I hope to avoid. So in order to get there, I think we need to have, at a bare minimum, I'll go back to what I mentioned before, is much greater precision about openness and the ways in which Glen was describing permissions, how those work in a way that's not a set of competing standards across a bunch of different companies, but some loose orientation to the ways that are going to develop this in a way that allows for a commercialization, but doesn't crowd the space out immediately with the low-hanging fruit of money-making.
JCR Licklider was the ARPA program officer who seeded the first 5 computer science departments in the country, one at Stanford, not one at Harvard. But and
Not
he,
my fault.
not Danielle's fault, not Danielle's fault, but one down the street at MIT, yeah. But he, in 1979, as the TCP/IP protocol was just starting to come together, wrote a wonderful piece called Computers in Government, in which he predicted that there were 2 paths that he could see the internet taking from here. One was that the government left the investment that it had made where it was, and that IBM, now it's Google and Facebook, but he imagined IBM filled in all the gaps and took over where his public multi-sector collaboration had left off and commercialized everything and went down the path that Rob was describing. And he said the better road was that the public and civil society continue to invest heavily in these technologies and to shape them in ways that would support integrated democratic society, because the protocols were thin little communication protocols. They didn't do 1/100th of what he thought was necessary in order to actually make a network society come to pass. That's what we fundamentally need, is we need the engagement from the public, not just being upset about what's happening, but shaping the space, investing to develop the elements that are most promising here. And we're seeing that here. This is an amazing event where you're bringing together actually a very tiny slice of the people from the Web3 space, but who are focused on the public problems rather than on the commercialization aspect. And this is just a little glimpse of what can happen when you put the resources behind the best stuff, rather than just either smacking things down with regulation or allowing the market to take its course. And I think that's fundamentally what we need, is like a network of digital ministers like they have in Taiwan. Taiwan has shown in an incredible way what that sort of public and civic investment can do to totally change the way that the society works harnessing these technologies. If we can build those across many countries and have them all work with each other to develop those common standards, I think there's every possibility of us shaping that future. But it won't happen without active decision by public and charitable organizations to focus on that goal.
And educate, obviously, people to get engaged.
Absolutely.
Daniel, do you want to?
Well, I'll second that. And I think Harvard should get some investment in this time
Yes,
around.
exactly.
So, we'll
in the next generation.
There you go. But no, I think it's hugely important that there be a cross-sector effort that has the concept of the public good at the center of it. I mean that phrase, the public good, as a moral statement, that there are things that we can do much better together than we can apart. But I also mean it very specifically in the technical sense, that there are public goods problems to solve. And that really is the kind of intellectual challenge of our time, and the possibility that Web3 offers, that we can have new solutions to public goods problems. But this will take universities, civil society, actors, advocates, forming a big network, working really hard on that question of how we protect self-government for free and equal citizens in the 21st century under completely transformed underlying social conditions.
Thank you, Daniel. You also summarized what Project Liberty is about. Really bringing this network together. And thank you for this hopeful discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.